what are some of the different types of transactions that are under the RPO and that we would like to start off with discussing this afternoon?
Right. Thank you so much, Shakila. Um, so first of all, we need to identify what is a RPA transaction.
Yes.
Now, long time ago, there was the old law that dealt with deeds. Now, the problem with that was there were a lot of fraud involved in it for one reason or the next. So the RPA was instituted to try to subvent that somehow. And what it really does, it really is, it's a conveyance instrument guaranteed by the state. So if there is some sort of fraudulent transaction thereafter, after it's registered, you can be compensated by the state. So you don't lose your hard-earned money. So it's always advisable. I always tell clients who are going to purchase or sell property under that new system how fortunate they are because they have something guaranteed by the state. So it's a better form, in my opinion. It's a safer form of conveyance transaction.
Yes.
It doesn't mean, however, that old law transaction is not valid or is not safe.
Correct.
Absolutely not. It does not mean that. It just means that this now is guaranteed by the state.
Yes.
Now, the different RPA transactions are very similar to the old law. So, for example, there is, under the old law, there will be a deed of conveyance, which means a vendor and purchaser. Under the new...
We went through that last week and we were kind of just letting them know the parties to a conveyance transaction, particularly with a deed. You have your purchaser and your vendor. So, essentially,
Right.
what you're saying, under the RPO, there is the same sort of transaction can occur, except it's called something else.
Yes, it's called a memorandum of transfer, and it's the same vendor and purchaser. Where there is a deed of gift, for example, under the old law system, it's called a memorandum of gift under the new system RPO. There are certain things that are slightly different. For example, under the new law, there is something called a memorandum of exchange. That is where, for example, two persons own a piece of property and they want to exchange which one is on the left, which one is on the right. They want to do an exchange. There is something called a memorandum of exchange. Believe it or not, there is something called that. So those are the different kinds of transactions under this system. Now, when you go ahead, Shakila.
Yes, lovely. That's very important and interesting to understand. So essentially most of the transactions that are on old law, and when we say old law, we're talking about transactions or title documents that are governed by deeds, that they are corresponding types in the new law system under the RPA that correspond to those types of transactions. So you identify deed of conveyance, the equivalent is memorandum of transfer under the RPO. Deed of gift, the equivalent is memorandum of gift under the RPO. And then you gave another example of a new one, memorandum of exchange, where essentially there's no real equivalent in the old law system. There's no deed of exchange, essentially, or is there?
Yes, correct.
Right. So, very, very interesting. So essentially, though, what are the differences between the two registration types of title, and how can someone identify distinctly, under which system their transaction was registered?
Okay. So under the old law, you would normally get a deed, and you would often get a deed. And for example, if someone is selling you a piece of property, you'd ask for a deed number, and it normally starts with DE.
Right.
And that is under the old law. Under the new law, it's something called a certificate of title. Now, there are only two. Well, there's the original certificate of title, and there's the duplicate. And that is the only two original documents that would be in existence. So one is held at the land registry, permanently fixed there, and one is held with the person who owns the property. Now, obviously, you could go and photocopy it, but in terms of an original document, there will only be two. Versus under the old system, anybody could go and get a certified copy of a deed.
Right.
Right? But under the new system, you can't do that. It's one copy. Right. So that is how you would be able to identify it. Now, when you do a transfer, a memorandum of transfer, a memorandum of gift, or a memorandum of mortgage, or memorandum of exchange, you don't get that city right away. You have to do the memorandum itself that needs to be registered first, and then it is endorsed on the certificate of title, and that's something else we could discuss further down.
Yes, most certainly. So I want to make sure that our guests who are joining us, they are with us, and that I think 𝗕𝗗𝗄 has done an excellent job with explaining the different transactions and some of the features of those transactions. But just for reiterating that you did state that you used some words there such as endorsement and CT and different things that we can certainly break down to help them understand. You mentioned there about you will not get when you see a deed, right? And we've identified that these transactions are under the old law. You will see DE with your deed number to identify a transaction and get a certified copy. How can someone identify an RPO transaction? Do they have DE numbers? And if not, what do they have to identify them?
Right. So the certificate of title does not carry a DE number, which represents a deed number. It has a volume number. That is the volume it's listed at in the records book of the registry, as well as a folio number. So if you purchase in land, for example, and somebody sends you volume 1, 2, 3, folio 3, 4, 5, you know for a certain, well, on the face of it, it's under the new law.
Right. So it's volume and folio to identify transactions or title under the RPO. Now, you spoke about endorsements and CTs. And this is something I really want. I certainly know that we've covered it in previous webinars, but for those of you who are new with us and now joining our segments, and even this evening, we want to go over that again. A certificate of title we'll be referencing hereafter as a CT, all right, which is the governing document that tells the story of how the title came into existence, who owns it, the identification of the parcel by its boundary descriptions, etc. That's on the CT, or the certificate of title, which is registered with its volume and folio number. When you say endorsed to the back, what do you mean by that, 𝗕𝗗𝗄? And if you could explain that.
Right. So as I mentioned, there will be one original and duplicate certificate of title, one that is lodged at the Registrar General's Department, Legal Affairs, and one that will be given to the owner. So if the owner now is selling that piece of land or is parting with possession of that piece of land through gift, through mortgage, or whatever, that city has to be taken in to be endorsed at the back of it. So each transaction relating to that piece of land will be endorsed at the back of the certificate of title. So if it's going from A to B, B to C, those would be the endorsement. It has to be in chronological order. On the first date, the first date of March 2022, it went to Jim or John Doe, and then on the 4th day of April, it went from John Doe to Susan, for example. So that is what is called an endorsement at the back of the city. A short, I don't know if it's about 10 lines, if so much, referencing the transaction of that particular parcel of land.
Right. And then that summary of the transaction that is stamped to the back of the CT will then at the end also have the volume and folio reference where that particular transaction was also registered, right? Correct? So,
Correct.
so if, she gave the example, John Doe had a transaction with Suzanne, and that was in fact a mortgage, they would have had to do a separate memorandum of mortgage with its own volume and folio number. But that transaction has to be summarized and endorsed in the back of the CT that governs the whole land, and state the volume and folio that memorandum of mortgage was registered. And when it's released, it will be stamped as released. Yeah. So, 𝗕𝗷𝗄,
And again, this is also why it's important to do title search when you're purchasing a property, because the person qualified to do a title search would ensure that the volume number that is being searched is the original volume number, not just a memorandum of mortgage number. Because if you search a volume and folio number on a memorandum of mortgage, it may not properly reflect the link between for the entire parcel of land, how it end up at that memorandum of mortgage. So that is why it's important, absolutely important, to do title search when purchasing property.